Hi, everyone. And so today I'll be talking about Chinese type systems. And part of the motivation for this came out of this desire when I was recently in Taiwan a couple of months ago, and I saw, if you've ever been, there's a bug cat Kapu themed 7-Eleven. I highly recommend you go check it out. And one of the things I was really enamored by is that when you look, there's this matching of both Chinese and Latin script and sort of the way they have this kind of handwritten cursive marker feel to them. And I thought it was really interesting that when I was walking around in a lot of places in China and Taiwan, that a lot of the signs and display systems were using this more handwritten feel as opposed to when you walk around the US, there's a different, more cursive quality. Part of this was also motivated by, at the time, I was also working on a handwritten cursive and display style typeface called Convo, inspired by the Paper Mario conversation typeface. This was also came from a Japanese original design where they used it in the Nintendo systems and then ported it over to English just for the American version. And so a lot of the original design choices were based off of Japanese kanas. And so a little bit about me. I'm Ivan. I make a lot of random stuff. I like making weird art, but sort of the cohesive thought around this is interest in how we as humans and as a society communicate and the sort of rigors and foundations around it. And so if you've ever been to a intro to graphic design or graphic design history class, they love to talk about movable type and the Gutenberg Bible. And so this is the Gutenberg Bible, printed probably around the 1450s. It's one of the examples of movable type. But I'm actually here to tell you that if they also talk about this as the first example of movable type, but I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. And in her book, by Patricia Lockwood, no one is talking about non-Latin typography. They forgot all about the East Asian scripts. And so we sort of go back, and the first example of movable type is this inventor during the Northern Song Dynasty. His name is Bi Sheng, and he created examples of both ceramic ware and wooden movable type. And so one of the issues with this specifically in Chinese is that there are so many characters to include. So with Latin scripts, you have basic 26 characters for uppercase and 26 for lowercase, but for Chinese and other script languages, you have all these characters that you need to keep track of, which is really, really difficult. And so one of this is because the Chinese history of the language script is really, really rich. This is sort of an example of kind of where it started to all the way to today. There's a very sort of pictographic / logographic. I think a lot of researchers are still like fighting and arguing about where it came from, but you kind of see on like the top, on the left-hand side is sort of this discussion from like movement of what a horse could look like back in the day to what it currently is now. And then also there's still different variations at the bottom. We have both pinyin and bopomorpha, which is used in both China and Taiwan. And so even like within those countries, there's still discrepancies around it. And now, even more recently, there is a student at MIT whose name is Zhao in 1914, who was looking at how can we make typewriters for Chinese, where it's like you have all these characters, there's no way that you can like constantly do this. And so he like pontificated about this idea of a type wheel for a 4,000 character typewriter where you would have all of your characters and they would sort of just like spin around. It was never actually made into fruition. And even more recently, in the late 70s and 80s at MIT, they were looking to how do we actually display this. So one of the issues is that Chinese typefaces, because they were so complex and hard to render, they were unable to be rendered on sort of early computers of the late 1900s. And so they looked into bitmaps. And so typically a lot of the bitmaps were created of a 5x7 grid. But one of the issues with this, if you ever talk to people, we talk to people who are really passionate, like the Chinese language is something of cultural and important significance. They really love and value that. And so they had to expand that grid into a 16x16. But one of the introductions of the issues with the 16x16 grid is that there's a high degree of symmetry among the language. And so ultimately one of the solutions that they went to was moving down to a 15x15 grid. But even with this, if you have a 16x16 grid and you want to develop a typeface that is comprised of approximately 8,000 characters in order to get a sort of basis for any kind of communication, that's approximately 256 kilobytes, and that definitely would not fit into a computer at that time. So there was a lot of struggles. It took a while, and it was just very, very hard to put on a computer. So if you're thinking to yourself, like, oh, maybe I'm interested, or like, I want to learn, so how do I actually write this? So one of the really famous characters, Yong in Chinese, is sort of used as the sort of prototypical example of how do you actually like write a character, because it's comprised of many different kinds of strokes. So here is like the basis of 8 strokes. We kind of have this dot at the top, dian, and then a hung to represent the horizontal strokes. But actually, even though this is kind of the basics, it kind of compounds into many more multiple strokes that exist. And so it sort of gets complicated fast. And you can kind of see that this becomes sort of like a permutation problem in its sense. Additionally, there's this idea called radicals. And so radicals are representations of a potential like idea or thought. So this is yen, which is the speech radical. And one of the really interesting things about Chinese systems is that with these sort of ideas is that you can kind of guess what the character is going to say based off the radical. Kind of going back to that pixel idea, like you can see here, one of the issues, especially with automation around kind of developing this, is that each character actually has to have a slightly different feel based off what radicals are placed next to each other. Additionally, there's also this idea of both semantic and phonetic radicals. And so semantic is sort of what the idea is trying to invoke, but phonetic is how you're trying to sort of know. But these in itself represent kind of like componentized ideas around how you can actually create characters. And then sort of there's also development in the 1960s because of low illiteracy in sort of the Chinese country. Chairman Mao during the Cultural Revolution was like, okay, we need to simplify everything. Traditional is way too hard. We need to get rid of a lot of strokes to improve literacy. And so you can kind of see on the left and the right is the simplified character versus the left is traditional, which is a lot more easier. But yeah, people, especially in China, are really adamant about it. It's like lots of civilization, and there's lots of culture tied to it. They're all super important. A really brief sort of classification around some of these. So if you're familiar with kind of Latin scripts, you'll know of like sans serifs and serifs in those regards. So in Chinese, there's a type style called Songti or Mingti, which is an allusion to kind of the Song and Ming dynasties. And you can kind of see they have more of like a serif-like quality. They're very much based around like a strong grid system. And they have kind of these like blocky elements. Additionally, there's a style called Heiti, which is more equivalent to a sans serif, and you can kind of see no serifs, very sort of like blocky, rectangular, and angular. There's one called Kaiti, which is more sort of a note to kind of brushstrokes and calligraphic notions, and so you can kind of see that in these like tapered edges. I think they look like super beautiful. And there's another called Fengsongti, which is like pseudo Songti, which is like a hybrid between the two that they were trying to make. And then going back to Bugcat Kapu, there's also this idea called Meishuti, which is more similar to a display. It translates to kind of like art style, art font, and so it's like more hard to describe, but is commonly prevalent on a lot of places. And so when we compare this to English, so the default set for an English language font contains about 230 glyphs. A font that contains all of the Latin scripts, which is over 100 languages, is 840 glyphs. And the simplified version of Chinese requires nearly 7,000 glyphs, and that's not including traditional, which includes 13,000. And then if you want to include all the characters, it's about 50,000. And if you want to use something that could be used in newsletters, that's around 20,000. So that's a lot of glyphs that you have to make. A lot of characters. Can you do this by yourself? Probably not. But there's an extension maybe to help build. And so this is an extension developed by a great type foundry based out of Paris called Black Foundry. And so what they did was they took this idea of sort of componentizing systems. And so here we have what they called like a straight line, which could be used as sort of the Dian interpretation back in that Yong character. And so they used interpolation to be able to define like, oh, the diagonal, the width, the height of these various characters. And so taking it from that, we can create sort of these, using this like straight line primitive, we're able to then create like another character, this character, which is Kol, which represents mouth, which is comprised of 4 straight lines. And from that Kol character, we can then go to a third character, which is Ping, which means which represents like food. And so we can create those 3 Kol characters and composite all of them together. So you're thinking to yourself, how do I actually use, if you want to like, you know, put a Chinese font in your actual website or you're using it somewhere? Well, lucky for you, it's actually supported by UTF-8. And so thank you to the web and Unicode for making this easy, because otherwise it'd be really hard. It's actually supported kind of in the last one, which is that ASCII characters are comprised in the first byte, but in order to get a lot of these sort of Chinese and East Asian scripts, they're supported across 4 bytes. And also, yeah, it works in CSS. So font family to the rescue. You can just like throw that in your CSS file and you don't have to worry about it. But the recommendation is that you always put the English version of the name first and then also the Chinese version, just in case you don't know which one it's mapped to in the font information. there's also a lot of interesting sort of things happening in kind of like, how do we reduce the font file size? Because if you think about it, if you have a sort of font file with like 20,000 characters, that's a lot of characters that is going to be passed in your bundle. And so there's a type studio called Yozacool based in Taiwan that is looking at sort of like similar to the way that you do tree shaking. They're trying to do that with fonts where they only send you the necessary glyphs in order to get that page to load. There's a lot of great other sort of software out there for finding free fonts. This is a GitHub repo of that. And also in CSS, they have writing mode from writing right to left, which like sometimes I like forget about. I'm like, whoa, CSS supports a lot of things. And so you can write right to left. You can also change the variation if you have both normal and traditional characters. And I just like to run through a couple of quick examples of just like things that I found really cool in mapping both Chinese and English systems. There's this designer whose name is Julius Hui. I think he's a Taiwanese type designer who did the New York Times logo, and you can kind of see in the character on the left, Zhong, which represents middle, it sort of maps to this kind of serif-like black letter-like quality. Here's the full logo next to the English logo. One of the other ones that was done is the Coca-Cola logo, and I think they did a really great job of preserving the swashes on the characters themselves and making it feel really cohesive with the English. There's also this Alice in Wonderland poster that was done when it came out in China as well, and this Taiwanese Design Expo, where they use some of that like pixel-like quality to map in both English and in Chinese. And then also as a nod to the sort of weird esoteric, this is an esoteric language called Wenyanlang that's based off of a lot of like old Chinese classical texts. And so the entire programming language is written, like the syntax is written as like old Chinese, like classical Chinese. And that is used and compiles to, unfortunately, JavaScript, but also Ruby. And so, yeah, hopefully, you learn some things or maybe you're interested. And so if you're a single designer working on making a Chinese typeface, there's this phrase in Chinese called jiayou, which you can also see on the right is a composite of the water radical and also this other character, yo, and it means to get gas, but also the slang interpretation means is good luck. And so I wish you all good luck. Thank you.